Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. On this sort of, I don't know, it's probably about 65 degrees. It's just a little bit cloudy, a little bit breezy. Today we're going to talk about psychotronic weapons. Now, some of you will invariably know what this is automatically, and others are like, I think I know what that is, and you probably do. This is a fancy word for weapons that are designed to control your mind from afar. Now, that could mean across your room. It could be someone out in front of your house. It could be someone in space. It could be someone driving by with a plane. It could be cell phone towers. The destination hertz that penetrates the human mind is 425 to 450. That's what they discovered a while back. Now, this is sort of an interesting tale, but it has been reported from so many different arteries that I think we have to take it serious. And because we're coming up on the end game, we have to assume that whatever they can do, they will do if they're forced to do it. You know, if we don't just lay down automatically. But this is tantamount to a scene to like a Terminator series, right? John Connor, or the dad of John Connor, whatever. John Connor's the guy? I don't know, whatever. The dude who came back in time. Before he came back in time, or even when he did, as devices were brought back from the future or they dealt with issues in the future, it was one of these situations where everyone's okay, then something starts happening, someone is not informed, which draws out the action, and they go, what's going on? And he says, oh, they're using psychotronic weapons. And it's like, what is that? And then he gives the definition. And then he says, this is what you got to do to solve the problem. Remember in Total Recall, there was a sensor up in the nose of Arnold Schwarzenegger, his character. My name was Quaid. And when he was Hauser giving himself the message in the suitcase, he said, dampen a cloth, because he was in a motel room at first, or hotel room. He dampens a cloth, wrap it around your forehead, because that'll knock out the GPS. Something you need to remember, because that's a very real technique. And then he was able to escape, and then he was using the Johnny Cab and all that kind of stuff. So in the modern age, if we were to get into some big, massive throwdown against Boston Dynamics robots, totally backstabbing military people, foreign countries, whatever the case might be, just satellites acting on their own, that ironically we paid for. I think that's the whole thing, is everything you're about to hear, either you paid for it, your parents paid for it, your grandparents paid for it, all the way back. The only other contingency is that you have drugs that end up paying for it. So that's the other tax. The invisible tax is the really downtrodden, the really beaten down, who have to buy drugs to get out of their state of mind. They're giving trillions away. And that's how these things transfer from public budgets to super covert budgets. So when you read about this kind of thing, you'll have a lot of writers that go with the, I think, fairly standard disclaimer, which is, this is all going to sound like sci-fi. This isn't going to sound capable. But the more if you've ever studied it, it's not even remotely strange. Now, the part for a person who's scientific and is familiar with how the brain works with electricity is that the specificity of these weapons is what starts to blow the mind. The more specific they can get, the more it is terrifying and amazing all at the same time, especially if you're an inventor of any kind. You're like, you actually figured out how to do that? And you're like, yeah, we can put a voice in your head. Now, I will remind you that in one of the recent episodes where I talked about Werner von Braun's assistant, she said that she was at a conference several hundred miles away. I want to say she was in Chicago and he was in the New York area or something like that. Whatever it was, she was like 800 so miles away. And he said, you're going to do this presentation on the subject matter. And she says, I can't do a presentation on that. I don't know anything. I don't really know about it, right? And he goes, don't worry. I'll be there when you need me. Just go there and stand on stage and I'll be there. And she claims, and she seems to be fairly reliable. I mean, her body language was very refined if she was lying. That's all I'll say. Anyone can lie. But she said that Werner von Braun's voice went into her head when she was on stage, and she simply parroted out what he was saying. When I checked on these projects, especially Project Montauk, which will be one of the last projects we talk about out of a series of 3, that's exactly what they said they could do, is put a voice in your head, which might actually be a hell of a lot easier than changing your mind controlling you, that sort of thing. Because that's sort of just broadcasting, one brainwave to another brainwave. And as long as we are human beings, there's probably some base comparisons, similarities. The technology works between the two brains. But trying to really master how this works, we're going to get into. But let's just review right off the bat sort of the basic platform we're talking about so that we can understand the more complex conversations that are going to come up. You're an energy-based being. And I don't mean at a E = MC squared level. I mean at your brain sends nerve impulses to all of your body parts, your heart. If you want to move your little toe, it's your brain doing the work through your nervous system, and that's how it happens. Any of you have ever seen those experiments where they hook up frogs' legs to, impulse circuits, and we zap a muscle and the leg kicks, same thing. But it starts to become a little bit more, if not a massively more confusing, once you take that principle, of which is very easy to understand, and you apply it to the brain. Because the brain is this unbelievable labyrinth that I will tell you a million times. The scientists have figured out how to mechanically mess with it, toy with it. And again, to this point, they're going to come up with fairly interesting techniques, of which are probably similar in some ways and different others, but to project images into your brain, whether they be voice images that you can hear or you think you're hearing, or visions, tendencies, because we know that when we're happy, there's a chemical balance in the brain, and there's certain nerves and glands and things in your brain that are going to be firing testosterone, dopamine, a bunch of different stuff in your head to get you to a certain state. So it may be that these chemicals are either sanctioned so they don't fire, or they're absolutely stimulated with an overwhelming projection of the state of mind that you as a human being are in when you're panicked, when you're happy, when you're relaxed, when you're zombified. So it's sort of like a platform, if you think about a technological platform. I'll give you another example of a platform, in case you're new to the channel. The Saturn V was a platform to supposedly go to the moon. It's really just a platform to get you into low orbit. And it's a great platform to do that. It was a massive accomplishment by man. The thing took off and disappeared. It didn't blow up on the tarmac, and that in itself is an incredible accomplishment. But once you've got something to put something into space at 200 miles up, an infinitesimal percentage of getting to the moon, as a matter of fact, you then can build a business at 200 miles up, because you're like, hey, we can get to 200 miles up in 2 seconds. No problem at all. Okay, what do you want to do at 200 miles? Well, let's do some this and some of that. Communication satellites, all this other stuff. Okay. So once they start tampering with technology at different levels, you have these result sets that come back. Now, I'm going to mention a few things. I'm going to mention some of the more solid theories at the very beginning, and then we're going to go into some reports that various folks were in charge of various clandestine, meaning secret projects, and that one dovetailed into the other, into the other. Now, I have recommended a couple times to you folks, there's an app on your phone, and the reason why on your phone is more important than any other thing, and I do use it on my desktop computer, and it really does have a pretty darn good effect, but it's called Brain.fm. And Brain.fm uses something that has got two different names. One is called Sympathetic Harmonies, which I think is a much better name for it. The more formal name in today's nomenclature is Sympathetic Resonance. What they have realized is that if I just broadcast, white noise at you, it might calm you down. It might relax you. And the way that that's working is that it's giving you a sort of evenly distributed pattern of sound. Will go in both your ears, and it sort of overwhelms your mind from distractions. It allows you to focus. In the center of your brain, even in a white noise storm, you're able to look at your computer and focus. That's why a lot of folks, when they listen to music, it's drowning out all the other subconscious thoughts you might be having. Does my girlfriend like me while I'm coding this software package or something? It just wipes all that clean. And if it's uplifting to you, and that's the kind of person you are, it's sort of like Top Fuel Dragster kind of heavy metal, or it's rap and it's just inspiring or whatever. It gets you focused electronically in your brain. That's what music does to you. That's why you have to be careful, is that the techno music that's sort of arrived in the 21st century, there's a lot of folks studying it and realizing that really negative frequencies are being injected in the music, putting you in a further state of suggestibility, such that when lyrics come in and say, go kill somebody, I kissed a girl and I liked it, all this other stuff, you could actually be getting pretty deeply programmed during just ingesting various music, which is why some of us, when we go back to straight up Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, whatever it is, even though I was a little tiny kid when those guys were out, if not just a baby, it still feels better to me. Boston, ELO, just some of those really, Journey, all those old bands, right? Sometimes the other music comes in and it sounds amazing, but I feel like killing somebody after I'm listening to a tune. I mean, it makes you aggro, not good. So sympathetic harmony / resonance, what it's doing in brain.fm is it's sending in one vibration into one of your ears through your earbuds and a different vibration in your other ear while playing some sort of music or sound waves over the vibrations, just the straight up frequencies. And you'll hear it, you'll feel it. It's got this weird puttering frequency to it. And my God, it is almost automatic. If it says you're going to relax, you will be relaxed. If it says you're going to sleep, you're going to sleep. I mean, it is phenomenally powerful. And the free version of the app is really easy to get a hold of. I pay for it, and it's worth every dime, especially if you're in a creative situation or you're in which could be coding, could be writing story, could be just anything where you super need to concentrate to do what you're doing. You don't have customer-facing interactions. By 1967, the United States government, through the Department of Defense and DARPA, had completed an experiment that was able to achieve seven different states of consciousness for a human being. And just imagine, happy, sad, melancholy, all these different things. But the other one was zombification. Now, I want to pause you there, because the easy state is death. To completely scramble the mind and make somebody just puff, just poof, their brain just overflows or overloads like a fuse, and you're gone. That was probably done decades before. So if you're thinking that one is the hard one and everything else is easy, it's the opposite direction. Killing you with sound waves, electromagnetic frequencies is easy. That's where we got the neutron bomb, right? The smart bomb that kills all the people, but leaves all the structures standing, and then, the elite do what they want to do with the world, right? Consequently, there are techniques to insulate yourself against some of these technologies, but then again, you might look a little silly preparing for that particular Holocaust. So it just depends on how serious you take it. If the world went to crap and you see a cascade of ever-increasing reports of these kind of things happening to people, most of the people think those other folks are crazy. And some folks are going to, like you, if you hear this and you do your own research, which I highly recommend you do, you'll be bracing for impact. You'll get away from major cities where the targets are going to be. And I want to preface this with something sort of strange, which may or may not have any merit. I don't know. I have at least 4 different listeners that I've talked to over the course of 6 years. Very sweet people. And they will, when I talk to them, they will report that they are dealing with these attacks, seemingly from the sky, that they have been attacked. Now, the only thing that's interesting that comes out of this is that I think that one of the side effects for at least a couple of these individuals, and I'm not judging and I'm definitely not faulting them for trying to deal with something that at first was probably, if this is true, almost too much to deal with, is that if you had this technology in the super advanced 21st century state, you're always going to be upgrading it, and you're going to need to test it in places where you can actually get to the people and see how it affected them. And you're not going to want to do it in super populated areas because you don't need 100 people turning in the same report. You really just want to hit a couple individuals, one individual, especially with someone that has a background that may not be Ivy League, right? And so they say something very accurate, they seem crazy, and therefore everyone dismisses them. Boom, boom, wipe your hands, case closed. But I do know that drugs like methamphetamines will be involved in these people's lives because they're simply feeling like they're going nuts. It might put them in a state of panic, and so drugs take them down off the panic. Imagine you get a bunch of people who are having this happen to them. We insulate them properly. Let them know the reason why you're gravitating towards this drug is because you're dealing with these experiments. And of course, we can't find any paperwork. We can't get anyone to admit it. But once we insulate where they live, we put up the 5-key Faraday system on at least 5 of the 6 walls in their house. Floor probably already insulated and grounded properly. They no longer get this. It'll be a little isolating, of course. I mean, technically speaking, you could build hats. I mean, this sounds nuts, but you could build a Faraday hat fairly quickly out of just a little bit of copper wire. But being grounded is the big trick. So once I did a deep dive on this, it became pretty evident to me that it is possible. That what sounded like absolute craziness is not so crazy. Now, here's the only caveat I would ask anyone who feels like they've had this happen to them to do, to keep yourself out of being perceived as nuts, right? If they're pulling this experiment on you, they're probably looking for a fairly acute thing to happen to you, meaning a very intense change in your state of being. They're not looking for little tiny things to occur. The reason being is if they just gave you a little tiny thing, unless you made a phone call they could monitor, you sent an email that someone could monitor, you text on some sort of social media, or they're eavesdropping on your house or watching you, which they might do all the above. But if they're like, just as a weird experiment, they're like, you want blueberry pie. You really want it. You really want it. You really want it. And someone goes, man, I got to find me some blueberry pie. And they're like, boom, it works. It's not terrorizing you. It's just making you eat too much, right? But if they were to study your profile, your psychological profile, find out whether you're religious or not. If you're not religious, then what do you believe? Because if you're not religious, then, man, they could make you have other experiences that may be more alien. Whatever the case might be. They could put voices in your head and then watch what happens. You're just, imagine that you had great integrity with your family and all of a sudden now you're nuts for the time being that they have done this to you. And if you're not able to sort it out, that you were attacked, you think it's actually part of you, and you think you're going nuts. My advice for anyone would be to move around a lot if you think this is happening to you. And I would probably recommend getting into a very populated area where this would be much more difficult for them. Lots of security cameras for someone trying to nail you, and they just switch to some other target. There's no reason for them to chase you. You would have to be a golden child of results for them to continue messing with you. All right. So now, let's look at the platform technology that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode before we get in these projects here. Because some of this documentation is a little hard to believe, but I think the core truth of these projects is in there. Like, again, we know that silicon chips exist. If somebody came up to you and said, silicon chips were given to us by the Roswell crash in 1947, It doesn't matter if that particular claim is true. You still have the silicon chip. So let's do whatever you want to do with silicon chips, if you feel me. So with this Brain.fm app, what's going on is the app is producing a left and right ear wave. And as long as you get it next to your head, well, what's going to happen? The device is known as earbuds, or your earbuds from your wired unit, are going to jam a frequency into your brain. Well, we know that you can hear stuff, right? And we know that waves of energy will go deeper into your brain than just the drum, or the hammer, inside your ear. And so in the center of your brain, they also know that your left brain, your right brain are going to be processing these signals. And as those signals mesh inside your head, that they will combine to create a third frequency inside your head. It's just something that happens. You know, when you have these Tibetan monks that can sing in 15 different tones at once. I mean, it's unbelievable. I once thought that was just malarkey, but after I saw it, a few specials where they really analyzed it and put it on a oscilloscope, you got to see it and you're like, oh my God, this stuff is real. But what is a wave of energy? Well, that's what radar is, and radar has been around for quite a while. And we're not talking about a tremendous amount of energy to get through the human skull. 420 to 450. As long as it can hit your head, they can get you. Now, again, if you have really thick walls in your house, they're literally going to have to park out in front of your house, have some disguised broadcast unit, and they're going to have to either punch through your drywall, or they're going to have to find a window to hit you from. Or they're going to have to hit you with a much more powerful system that is accounting for the deterioration in the signal going through your roof, going through your insulation, going through your ceiling. And believe me, they'll just calculate it up. If you're in a skyscraper, it's just a window. Well, they don't have to use so much. They can just hit you from outside, right at the window. They're renting the place across the street, and they just nail you. You're on the 60th floor. They're on the 60th floor, maybe the 40th floor, and they're nailing you, making you react. Because all they have to do technically, depending on what their end result that they desire is to give you a seed of a problem. What if you talk to God when you're, sitting on the pooper, right? And they got you. When you sit in that room, it's easy to get to you. Or when you lie on the bed, you're driving in your car. You're totally exposed when you're in public transportation. And they're physically hitting you with one of those sound dishes to listen to what you're saying. It just goes the other way. And they make God talk to you. And even if they can just get a couple voice lines into your head every day, 2 or 3 times a day, because they can't get to you the rest of the time of the day, they're putting seeds in your brain that you're nuts, that you're listening to a divine being that's telling you what to do. Dangerous. So with the technology that we have now, the idea is, can they focus a beam from a device to hit you specifically? Obviously, in close proximity, no problem whatsoever. The one that we would have to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt is something from space. Now, I have a relative that, was reading license plates in the Wichita Town East Mall parking lot in 1982. Reading license plates. So the idea that we've got Google Earth that can't quite get down to the ground is absurd. That technology's been around for 38 years, 39 years now. And I'm sure that my relative who saw it and dealt with the technology, that wasn't invented on the day he saw it. It was revealed to him on that particular day. Well, the idea is they just have to focus a beam of energy. And believe me, this is not only just for the individual, but it's also for a group, so a whole household could get hit. At this point, it's not really being weaponized for any specifics necessarily. I'm sure it has been. And you hear about these reports all around the world where embassies are getting nailed with sort of frequency weapons to make them have headaches, to mess with them. So who knows what the end the result of that is, but now it's been happening in China, it was at Cuba, and a few other places in the world. They're all reporting this kind of thing. So they're sort of revealing to you that this tech exists. And no one's saying that's an absurd assertion. This technology doesn't exist. What they're backhanding you with is, oh yeah, this totally exists, and gosh darn it, they're using it against us. So I did a show on the Philadelphia experiment. The Philadelphia experiment was the notion that they had wrapped a ship in a bunch of wires and super duper energized them to the point they resonated a ship out of view. It traveled down the coast, appeared, and then came back. That's roughly the notion. And just like the fabled statements, deckmen fell down inside the deck. They were inside the metal and all this other stuff, just like the movie said. Now, whether or not that actually occurred, we're just going to have to do our research and make our own decisions. I'm not personally convinced that particular one happened. But then again, the interesting thing is that imagine you did a little experiment like that, and you actually made something unbelievable happen. And I mean, use that word as literal as you possibly can. You immediately saw results that defy every sense of reality that you're aware of. The ship's hull was resonated to a permeable state because the molecular structure of the ship was excited by the electromagnetic field. Soldiers then, through gravity, just start falling into the metal. Now, why didn't the human beings do the same thing? Why didn't they liquefy? Well, we don't know that they didn't, but the big one is that we're much more complex as a being than, say, a magnet, right? In a magnet, you've got all the electrons aligned in one direction, and that's why when you put them together in one way, you get repulsion, and you flip them around the other way, and it sucks together. It's because everything's aligned, but a human body is very different, and there's all kinds of funny experiments where objects are put on these sort of seesaws where they're trying to sense gravity as per the phenomenon definition, which it never works, right? But you have like a mouse and a piece of steel. And of course, the mouse doesn't cause anything to happen, but the piece of steel does what it does, right? So men getting embedded in the ship, it makes sense to me as long as the lead or the iron or the metal that the ship is being built out of is being all resonated at its natural frequency, shaking it basically into a temporary pudding. And the reason why the ship holds together is that the electricity is going in waves, very, very quick, probably millions of times per second waves. But every time it comes out of that wave, the moving particles stabilize back to what they were, and then it moves. And so it's basically going from permeable to not permeable. So as these soldiers are falling through, they're probably falling through at the exact frequency of the electricity, which from a human perspective is instantaneous, most likely. So one of the tales of how this mind control harmonic/resonant technology came about was through a project called Project Rainbow. The Project Rainbow was the name of this Philadelphia experiment. So like August 12th, 1943, the U.S. Eldridge, which was a destroyer, goes through this experiment inside Project Rainbow. Now, according to them, what they got back was a tremendous data set of all kinds of weird anomalies that occur as a result of doing this experiment. So imagine that, I'm trying to think of a decent analogy where we know, well, the atom bomb, for instance, right? The atom bomb's goal from the military was to create a fission reaction that wouldn't completely lose control of itself because of the inertia of the universe as things split apart and energy is freed. The ethereal winds of the internals of an atom are released. It's going to bump into more ether, and then it will slow down the reaction so bombs don't continue to blow up the entire universe, right? Let's hope we never figure out that sacred geometry. But what did we figure out about an atom bomb? We figured out that it creates cell damage, which is known as radiation. It actually so pulverizes the mass that is around the bomb, being the atmosphere, being it objects, water, food, that it gets irradiated, meaning the electron orbits that are in stable atoms start to get destabilized because an atom, which we can go with the traditional definition of how an atom's put together, because that is technically good enough for what we're talking about. The true subatomic genetics of it are different in their ethereal base, but that doesn't tamper with any of the math that we know about atoms, so we can continue to talk about them in the traditional sense. But they are made in a very particular strategic way, which is where we get the elements in the periodic table. But when you start messing with those orbital patterns, it's supposed to have 4 electrons, supposed to have 1 electron. When you start messing with it, you start unraveling the atom. Take a hydrogen atom, which has 1 neutron, 1 proton, 1 electron. Well, remove one of those 3 things, and you no longer got a Rubik's Cube anymore. You got something that's dissipating and probably turning into a flame. It's thermalizing. Why? Because nothing can hang on to itself at that point. You need those 3 components in a strategic orbit / 3-dimensional spherical orbit, which is a bunch of ether going in that particular configuration, to hold it together. You pull out the electron, and I don't even know, honestly, if you pull out the electron, which is created by a dielectric wave hitting a magnetic wave, which is a natural occurrence in the universe, I do think it would just dissipate into nothing. Okay. So in the atomic bomb, you have also materials all around the ground zero lost some of their mass. As my physics teacher explained it back in the 80s to me, he said they would take an I-beam, for instance, that looked completely intact after the explosion, and they would melt it down. And the volumetric displacement of the melted metal was less than what the original mass was. Infinitesimally, but definitely significant. The reason being is that as this atom bomb's coming by, what they believe occurs is that it's thermalizing a minute amount of the mass inside the beam, on the external of the beam, and the inside of the beam. So even though it appears to be untouched by the bomb, it's actually been touched by the bomb, and it's lost a minute level of structural integrity. I'm sure that it was fine to hold up whatever building afterwards, but the reason why I'm telling you this is that they discovered a tremendous amount of extra data that came as a result of these experiments. So what they claim about the Philadelphia experiment is it revealed rips in time. It revealed damage to the human body, obviously, damage to ships, and all kinds of other things. So to recall just briefly the way that this experiment had worked is that they had several massive Tesla coils. They aim a tremendous amount of electromagnetic waves at the ship. The ship started glowing green, and it's in this Philadelphia port. And eventually the ship started to create a resonance of its own. And so it would be like having a speaker hit a big piece of wood, and then that whole piece of wood turns into a speaker on its own, creating a third or secondary effect that perhaps they didn't account for. But the ship supposedly wraps itself in a natural sphere of green light, vanishes from Philadelphia, appears several hundred miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, which then it was said to be witnessed there, and then teleports back to Philadelphia. Now, the absurdity in my brain is that why Norfolk, Virginia? I mean, did you have another system over there? Did you create some weird siphon to get over there? It wouldn't just randomly show up in water. Now, if they said, it was hovering over a swap meet in Oklahoma and then back, then I'd be like, yeah, that sounds right. You just didn't know what the hell you were doing. You had a weird side effect. So some of the more sort of romantic stories about what happened, and by God, if these are real stories, it's only tongue-in-cheek romantic, is that crewmen, after being involved with this experiment, if they did indeed survive, and of course there are reports that crewmen just vanished into nothing, which hopefully they just went someplace else and it was decent, maybe a different time zone or something. One crewman was said to be at home, and this is outrageous, but just, whatever. that he got up after eating dinner and walked through a wall and no one ever saw him again. Another one is that a couple crew members working together up to 18 days later, whatever, burst into flames and simply vanished, out of probably death. So the project was canceled according to the results of the project, and that it was so volatile and so chaotic that they just couldn't do it anymore. Now, I will tell you that no one in command would ever stop that kind of research. The only thing they would do is move it to another location, make it covert, and then rewind the power supply that they're dealing with. Now, remember, I told you guys in a couple episodes back that there was a dude that said that he was in a laboratory. He wasn't supposed to be there. And actually, sorry, it's not even true. He was working on a different project. He had top security clearance, but he was going to his CO to report the results that he was dealing with. Just happened to walk into the middle of an experiment, 1953. He said there was a plexiglass box or glass box. There was an ashtray in the center, a glass ashtray. They said, okay, everyone be quiet. We're about to do this. And then zap, the lights go down. This thing happens. And he looks back and the ashtray's gone. And everyone's excited. They run into the next room and there's another box of the same exact type and the ashtray is in there. And then someone said, who the hell are you? You didn't see any of this. Get the hell out of here. Now imagine that this ashtray thing, which seems, it's Tron 1982, man, where they zapped Kevin Flynn into the computer. It seems sci-fi. But if there's any truth whatsoever to the Philadelphia experiment, and you could even shave off a lot of the outrageous claims of things, but still have a ship that vanished out of sight. It doesn't go to Norfolk, Virginia or anything. It just vanishes out of sight. And they just metabolize that up and figure out how to stream sort of folding space between those two boxes, right? So the object is not dismantled necessarily. It's simply shifted from one place to another, just like the spice in Dune, which I think is brilliant. The worms that folded space, so everybody could travel around the galaxy. Brilliant. So Project Rainbow is canceled, and it turns into Project Phoenix, or the Phoenix Project. And this is where we bring in Dr. Wilhelm Reich. What's interesting about this dude is that he's sort of a bona fide genius in that, one, he had a lot of money given to him to do a lot of experimentation. And guess what? This genius was an ethereal-based scientist. That's nice, because that's where all the geniuses are in the world, ether-based sciences. He discovered a new form of energy, which they call orgone energy. There's orgone and there's dead orgone, or DOR, for D-O-R, dead orgone energy. And he said that this was, that he had basically discovered this different type of energy. And remember what I told you, that the only thing scientists ever acknowledge is energy that is tangible through electrons. If we can't sense it in a machine, man says it doesn't exist. So your soul doesn't exist because they can't sense it. Retarded, right? So he developed a new device to sense this orgone energy, and he said, look, what's interesting about it is that it is a form of ether in the universe, and it is in everything, and it especially is inside of human beings. And there was dead orgone energy inside human beings, DOR energy. He immediately starts experimenting with modifying this energy because he figured out a way to sense it. Now again, this would be a device that, if created and sensed a whole new paradigm of energy, would be the most coveted hidden thing immediately. Problem for the history books trying to rewrite this, if they did, was that the Soviets got a hold of his papers because he wasn't completely squashed, in terms of like a black project, until after he published what he had discovered. So immediately, and this is where I get a lot of validation personally, and you tell me how you process this, but when we discover something like remote viewing and we spend over $1 billion on it, and the Soviets spend over $1 billion on it, and this is like an old money, man, 50s, 60s money. then it's probably got some tangible things to it, because I will tell you, I mean, it could be a comic book cover story for some other Black Op project. That could be the case. But I mean, imagine Black Opping a project with some even more far-fetched technology like remote viewing. It would seem like, well, let's say we got something like get oil out of the ground better, or something that's a little more tangible for Congress to fund, or if we get caught, at least looks like we're doing something legitimate instead of this, what seems like sci-fi technology of remote viewing what's in an envelope clear around the world simply by meditating in a chair and thinking about the GPS coordinates. I've got a whole episode on remote viewing if you need a review. Now, just about the time this guy is warming up, the Phoenix Project, goes to 2.0. And you get this other doctor by the name of, what is his name? Dr. John von Neumann is brought in, and he's a guy that was on the alleged Project Rainbow. And the problem is that we have this sort of collision of, it's not really a problem, but they've got to resolve the fact that they had weird anomalies from this Project Rainbow / Philadelphia experiment, which you have to assume that even if the Philadelphia experiment is a complete folklore tale, Rainbow is funded and it's in the history books, and so you have a situation where they're doing something, they're figuring something out. But what I'm about to say, it might sound sci-fi to some people, but we're going to stop and explain it so it completely makes sense to you, which is when you start messing with the fabric of the universe, you will mess with what humans perceive as time. What is time? The most basic definition of time is the perception of your existence as things change from state to state, right? The only reason why you believe in time is because you have memory. You can remember when you were younger, and now you can remember yesterday versus today, 5 minutes ago versus now. But what actually makes state changes possible? Things moved in the universe. You don't get older unless your body moves. You don't have a tomorrow unless the molecules of today move into a different state with a level of predictability, because human beings own a huge collection of molecules, and your friend calls you at 2 o'clock every day. So you have a little bit of predictability. But now, what if we were to take the fabric of the universe for an instant even, and we were to slow it down, speed it up, through agitation of electromagnetic fields? Oh, well then you're going to have time differential problems. You're going to maybe even feel like you're running in water for a split second. You're going to see everything else move faster, and you're going to be moving slower, or vice versa. So this Newman guy is bringing in a subset of results that came out of this Project Rainbow that is dealing with a time issue. So I should also remind you guys that, or be clear about this, the Philadelphia experiment was to try and stealth a ship, to bring it out of phase with the eyeball mechanisms / photon waves that come off the ship, and either create sort of, not necessarily a black hole, but definitely some sort of mirrored surface where there's no light coming off the ship. The light's stuck there inside the electromagnetic field that's around it, because it is moving so violently and so quickly that the ripples of light, just like the ripples in a pond, when you throw a rock in, the ripples hit a barrier and no longer go on the other side. You could do that. Just put a cement pipe or ceramic pipe inside the water. I mean, geez, it'd only have to be maybe 10 inches tall and maybe a couple feet around. Saw a barrel in half, put the half in there and throw a rock inside the center of that barrel. And as long as the walls of your barrier are strong enough to absorb the waves, the ripples from the rock, it's never going to create ripples on the outside. So it's sort of what they're trying to do, but they're doing it in an electromagnetic manner around the ship. But this thing that they said they discovered, and if it's not real, it's brilliant sci-fi, let's just put it that way, but they call it the time reference point. The time reference point is, if you go back to my episode on space travel, and you look at my argument for ethereal winds that are required to make all things exist in the universe, right? It is literally the gasoline that makes everything happen. It's the dust in the universe that has no charge. It has no attributes whatsoever, but its behavior creates designations. Again, water spiraling down into a drain is a vortex. Well, if I ask you what it is, you'll say it's a vortex, and I say, no, it's actually just water, and you're saying, okay, you're an asshole. Because you're giving it a name because of the way it behaves. Okay. So when I was talking about the UFO, I said, look, if you created a UFO that created 100% block of all ether from the outside universe traveling through the UFO, you would turn this thing on, and the UFO and everybody inside would utterly vanish out of existence almost instantaneously. Why? They're not being fed what they need. A bunch of you have seen those balloon characters that fly in parking lots, right? They got a fan. It's not even a balloon. It's just a fan at the bottom blowing up a pillowcase, and it's got the dudes, that wobble to get your eye to look over at the car dealership. What happens when you turn off the fan? It just flops right to the ground, doesn't it? Those Santa Clauses that you inflate in front of your house, same thing. That's exactly what we're talking about. Instead of oxygen and its upper construct molecule, we're simply talking about what the universe is made out of. So they said, and for me, it adds a little bit of credibility to the Philadelphia experiment actually having occurred. Now, again, what actually occurred, whether or not dudes burst into flames, walked through walls, whether they were traumatized, the claim is the following. This was so aggressive when this happened around the Aldridge that every crewman that was inside the envelope of these wires being charged by these massive Tesla coils, and remember, Tesla coil is different than anything else you've ever dealt with in terms of energy creation, capacitation, and augmentation. Tesla coils can go from 0.5 volts to like billions of volts in seconds. I mean, depending on how big you build this thing. So they're aggressive machines, man. Don't ever mess around with one unless you know what the hell you're doing. Buy the book. You can still find it by Mark Bean. He has passed. I've got his book in the house. When I did my Tesla episode, I brought up his book. He teaches you how volatile these systems could be. You can just die touching. I got 2 in my house, and I got to be very careful with them. But they said that the soldiers inside experienced a separation from the normal reality that they've been in their entire life. And they actually coined the phrase back in the day inside this Phoenix Project Part 2, a virtual reality. Meaning it was a separate reality from this reality and that it was entirely electrically quarantined from this reality. And they said that for some reason, a bunch of the soldiers involved with this came home with virtually incurable trauma, incurable PTSD. But this experiment supposedly happened so quickly that you don't have a normal scenario experience where PTSD is a traumatic experience that's been lost in your mind. A bunch of soldiers in a vehicle drive over an IED. It blows up. Everyone's knocked unconscious, which means they potentially lose up to 10 minutes of their memory. It's in their short-term memory and hasn't been filed away with their universe data bank. Basically, it's in their human container and not out in the universe where they can get it later at a later time. So they have to, at therapy, I have a whole episode on PTSD if you want to see that, they have to reconstruct in your mind what was going on at the time that this traumatic event occurred so that you could latch onto it to put it to bed. And virtual reality, coincidentally, ironically, is actually now being used and having an 80% success rate where they recreate the town, they recreate all the vehicles, the people. And it's so important to get this right that they said, the guy I talked to, it's in that facility I just talked about in another episode. He said that if a gun is in the wrong place, it can completely screw up the buy-in. But they've taken so many notes about everything that they will know, okay, that magazine was over there behind. It was a Playboy issue, October, 2017 or 2007. And it was tucked in there. It was upside down and backwards, and everyone had seen the portfolio or the centerfold or whatever. And that was been ripped out and put on the side. All that stuff's super important. But supposedly what happens to these individuals is this thing shocked them, separated, honestly, what sounds like they're talking about, I'm not even joking, It sounds like their body separated from their soul, and then they reattached, and that was leaving them with a, maybe it didn't reattach well. I know it sounds nuts, but they had an uneasiness about them, is sort of how the profiles read. They're just jittery, and they don't know why. Now, again, in our world, we know why. Traumatic experience. Some people got injured. You imagine you wake up and you don't have limbs. You were just a soldier and you wake up and your arm's gone and you're like, oh my God, I don't even remember how this happened. That's trauma, people, you know. So imagine you disconnected from your very internal spiritual being and then came back, right? But what this revealed, and remember, you got 1900, okay? And someone says to you that they're broadcasting a telegram. Makes complete sense, right? Because you have a wire and it's got electricity and it flows over. You touch it, oh, that's hot, right? And again, I'll just stress as a digression, if you want to see, read about some of the most innovative electronics ever developed by man, study the evolution of the telegram and how they were able, the failures and successes in engineering and re-engineering of getting a signal to travel across the United States on a wire. Because it kept losing its signal, it kept losing its strength, and they kept boosting it in different ways, and it wasn't helping. And when they finally figured it out, it's just a fascinating dive if you want to do that. But this experiment revealed that human beings exposed to electromagnetic energy had problems. And so they were able to go to this 2.0 of the Phoenix Project to specifically study in one division of the experiment. The other division was to study, again, potential time reference points and continue studying stealth technology, potentially going to that teleportation technology, which is the asteroid from 53. And again, the testimony from the Serious Disclosure Project that talks about that, the dude's one of the good guys. I mean, he literally does not have the polished, seemingly like, I don't know, you know what those guys are really polished that are deep inside the black ops stuff. I mean, they can talk your ear off for 10 hours and never stop. And you have the guy that looks afraid. He's afraid of even talking about it. That's a little bit better. But anyway. So this kicks off this embryonic stage of like, well, let's expose the human body to a bunch of electromagnetic experiments and just see what happens. And guess what? A lot of things occurred. But now imagine you have these experiments where you're just doing arbitrary things at human beings. Probably even experiment with animals first. And again, don't get this confused with those experiments you see where the bull has had a chip put in the back of their brain and they're coming at the matador guy and they hit the chip and the bull just stops. He's being basically electrocuted, so his brain's like forgetting everything it's doing. Yeah, that works, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about literally putting this from the outside world through the skull to create very specific emotions. So every type of experiment like this needs a location where they can actually conduct the experiments and not worry about being caught. And so there was a decommissioned Air Force base called the Montauk Air Force Base, which was opened in 1971 and given over to these folks. And so you have the Phoenix Project 2.0 is the overlaying project that's running this situation. Underneath that, they've got the Montauk Project, which is basically going to be creating a radar dish to do a bunch of experimentation, okay? The radar dish is called the SAGE radar, S-A-G-E radar. And if you remember, there was, in fact, the Dark 5 channel did a beautiful episode on this where they talked about that big radar dish that the Russians created, and they were broadcasting this horrific signal at the United States, I think the northern region of the United States, and people were getting ringing in their ears, and everybody was getting sick, and they hit their own people and all this other stuff, and finally someone figured out what it was and said, you got to turn that thing off or we're going to level your joint. And they did. So everybody's playing around with this electromagnetic experiments on humanity. But the Montauk Project has several elements to it which are going through these various experiments. And this is where they achieve all these different states of being. inside the human mind. So again, one of the most difficult things to do, and I've been involved with a couple movie projects where this is part of the technology, sort of the base concept of the technology, which is the Kurzweil project, the Singularity Project, to totally digitize the brain into a computer, which is a movie that my buddy wrote and was stolen and turned into Johnny Depp's Transcendence movie, right? The biggest challenge of putting a brain inside of a computer is that the brain is a physical three-dimensional thing, isn't it? At the same time, the Kurzweil thinks he's got the brain completely figured out, which is what you need to say to get your funding. Again, one of the Google wink wink founders is giving him a ton of money and space on the Google lot to run the Singularity Project. Now, they are discovering legitimate things about the human mind, so don't get that confused with my criticism. But it's a three-dimensional object of which to sense the very three-dimensional state of electrical charges and the synaptical maps of the brain itself is sort of running into the Heisenberg principle, uncertainty principle, which is to sense the charge of a particular three-dimensional point inside the brain, you will probably disrupt the charge in just trying to sense it. How are you going to sense it? By the time you've sensed one tiny infinitesimal region of the brain, and you try to move to another region of the brain, you have created your own butterfly effect inside the brain, triggering a bunch of cascading reactions to your sensing system. So in trying to digitize the human brain at any one state is like trying to figure out every molecule in the atmosphere of the world so that you can predict weather perfectly. Go read the book Chaos, and you'll get schooled in that really quickly. So the technology has to be very rudimentary in terms of the mechanisms by which we use to perceive reality, and what are probably three of the biggest ones. Well, sight and sound are the two most powerful ones you could play with. Now, sound is a little more obtuse in its mechanism to get into the brain. Sight is very precise. You have your eyeballs that are organizing a mesh of data that then has to stay intact as it transfers to your visual cortex. It's going to be projected, upside down and backwards, and then your brain's going to rasterize that into your head. If you could get the subject attached to a device that can, like a dot matrix printer, write it directly into your visual cortex, then you can obviously probably inject sight of some sort of resolution. Depends on how amazing the connection is. But the third one would be your overall physical state. Well, that's going to be a chemical cocktail in your brain created by various mechanisms in your brain firing the cocktail. Seriously, how does the cocktail work at a bar? It's a bunch of different ingredients, right? Put too much of one thing in, doesn't taste like the thing that you want. It's not a Manhattan, it's more of a old-fashioned, etc., etc. So they're going to have to figure out a way to hit your brain with a resonating frequency that is going to, in general, get certain systems to shut down and certain systems to turn on, or to turn on and turn off in a sequence to give you that physical cocktail in your mind to make you think you're in a particular state of mind. You're happy, you're sad, you're scared to death, you're doped out of your mind. Now, zombification, for me, is a very interesting concept because that was the one that's the most terrifying one. Example being, you've got guns in your house, you're in America, you're thinking, over my dead body, they're never getting these guns out of me, and soldiers won't necessarily come into my house to take them away because they're patriots as well. All they have to do is get blue helmets to come over that don't give a crap about this country, and then they have to hit you with a sustained state of energy to literally give you a shock treatment situation where they're going to reset your brain. And there's going to be a countdown. They can either keep it on you the entire time they're seizing your weapons. You go limp in your front room. You may or may not remember the moment. The blue helmet guys have shielding in their body. They come in, grab your guns out of your house, leave. They turn the ray off, and you got 20 minutes, 30 minutes before you stop drooling on yourself. Your guns are gone. There was no battle. It's a very aggressive program because there are billions of guns in this country, but weirder things have happened, right? So for me, zombification is probably one of the first things that they were successful at. And it's the specific emotions that are a little bit more intense. Now, in terms of the woman that is von Braun's assistant, Dr. Carol Rosen, she says that von Braun broadcast a speech into her head while she was standing on stage. Now, if that actually did occur, then someone would have to be on site with some sort of massive transmission methodology to basically get him speaking in some microphone. It's going to have to be transmitted pretty quickly, But again, back in the day, our radio stations, but this was supposedly in the 70s, they did broadcast much more powerful frequencies to cover much bigger geographical areas in the United States, and then the FCC kept cutting those voltages down so that they could allocate more and take more money and turn it into a monopoly, right? But someone would have had to have been in the room with her, unbeknownst to her, shooting her in the face with this thing so she could hear his voice. The interesting thing about this is that we're not talking about a tremendous amount of energy, right? The brain works on milliamps, tiny, tiny flows of electrons. I mean, super tiny. And so you're not talking about having to hit her with, an industrial fan of electromagnetism to get this to occur. Again, it's like 425 to 450. I may have said 420. It's actually 425 to 450. Will get through the human skull. So imagine these cell phone towers that people go, oh man, you're conspiracy theorists, you got tinfoil hat because you're saying these things can manipulate the mind. Oh, really? 425 to 450? That's in hundreds, people. Your average 4G is dealing at 20 billion. 5G is going to be in its third phase, 100 billion hertz. Getting to the human mind, oh my God, that's like, a howitzer cannon shooting through a piece of tissue paper. No problem. I mean, talk about, it would use less energy than it does to make a phone call. I mean, it's crazy. And why doesn't it do that to you today? Well, because it's way over that state. And it's not trying to mimic anything in the human mind as of its current programming, right? Once you have a radar, well, you modulate based on a piece of code nowadays. It's not a hardwired radio from the 30s. You modulate based on what the program says. And so you modulate down, modulate up. I'll control you a little bit, and then I'm going to go this other direction. But the Montauk Project ends with this very interesting thing called the Montauk Chair. Now, whether or not it's real, I'll leave it up to you. Even the documentation that I've read is skeptical, right? It's trying to be cool. But then again, they try to blow off ether at the same time. So misdirection at all levels. But they built 2 Montauk chairs, and there was actually a synthetic transportation of what was coming out of the human mind when person A is sitting in the chair and person B is trying to receive what's in the chair. Now, to make this sound really scientific, okay, they say it's connected to the Cray 1 supercomputer, which again, your average, the iPhone 4S is 4,500 times faster than a Cray 1. So if there's any validity to this, think about your cell phone's power to modulate this kind of signal around the world. When a device can broadcast an electromagnetic signal, it becomes a device that can be entered into the overall category of machines that can potentially do things to you. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying it could be. Now, at the same time, there's rumors around the Montauk Chair that are sort of like, okay, I don't know if I'm going to believe any of this stuff now. But what I think is a brilliant disinformation campaign is to say, we blow off this Dr. Reich because he's an ethereal scientist, which is where all the guys who invented everything we're using to make this show were based in, right? Einstein created nothing. Tesla created everything based on the giants before him, Volta, Ohm, and Faraday. Okay. So you want people to lose track of ether at the beginning of this research because that'll lead you to other things that'll be amazing. Zero-point energy systems being one of them. See the Wardenclyffe Tower or my Tesla episode, which is 500. Now, to kind of throw a turd in the punch bowl of the Montauk Chair system and Project Montauk in general, maybe the chair is a fictional thing that was added to this legitimate DoD DARPA thing to get you to deprecate the Montauk experiments into La La Land. But there are rumors that have been inserted into this story about the Montauk Chair, which might make us throw the whole thing out with the bathwater, which is that aliens helped us develop the Montauk Chair. Specifically, and I had to read this twice because it doesn't have a Y, it has an I. Syrians helped us build this thing. Not Syrians from the Middle East with a Y, but Syrians with an I from the star Sirius. What's funny about that to me as an astronomer is that why not pick Sirius? It's the brightest star in the sky. Brighter than the North Star. Okay. Why not pick that? Because that seems like, can you say Voltan? Whatever sounds good is what you use, right? So the research documents that I have definitely poo-poo the alien thing and says it's really not important, but just so you know, people have said this, and so we got to say this as well, yada, yada, yada. But these two chairs were basically hooked up to the point where you could transmit thought back and forth, and that supposedly helped them refine any state of mind that you could then record the methodology and then play it back towards random people in the world. Basically, if you were going to create mind control technology based on electromagnetism projected to the brain of a human being, you need patterns, don't you? You need a pattern. It's just like those old sci-fi shows where, in fact, there's that beautiful one that's, it's one of the 1 hour Twilight Zones where a guy gets stuck in a little town and he finds out that a genius came to the town a long time ago and dropped off all this massive technology. But one of them was the replicator from Star Trek, but it was the early 60s, about 64. And it was a punch card time frame of computers. And so they really kind of preceding punch cards, but same kind of started technology, had a piece of paper that had the pattern, almost like a QR code, that made a ham sandwich, made a gun, made whatever you want. They take it out of the file and they put it in the machine, and then it would make the thing happen on the tabletop. Well, if you could take that QR code analogy in your brain and simply think of that as the configuration of electricity, it's going to make the mind do something very specific. You just make a data bank of it. Now, introduced from the modern age, a very scary technology that is mind-blowingly brilliant, fundamentally very simple to understand, but it's called machine learning. You start playing with human beings, subjects that are, and you don't blast their mind completely blank or anything or hurt them. And as long as you're willing to do that, then you could have volunteers from the military, volunteers from the science community, scientists even doing it on themselves. They know they're not going to blast themselves out and become Churchill or something. And so they simply try a bunch of different things, thousands of things, tens of thousands of things, back in the day in the 70s, writing down sort of the results. Then fast forward to whenever we think the military came up with machine learning. The interesting thing about military being way ahead of us, which of course they are, is that I think that there's a couple factors involved with this. There is the discovery delta between the military and us, or you could say elite or whatever, these projects, these black ops projects. And then you have the technological advanced delta, meaning if silicon chips came from an epiphany from a human being or from some alien ship, it's going to take them a while to figure out how it works. But they don't want to also absorb the R&D costs of developing it. So they will leak it in a particular manner that potentially won't hurt them to the outside private sector to then ingest and develop and make faster and faster and faster. When you watch Computer Chronicles, that show I did an episode on from the 80s all the way up to 2002, started in 83, the interesting thing about that show is it is the true chronicle history of all above ground technology that we have as the United States, but also foreign countries, especially Japan. So even though we might say, oh, well, Americans won't go faster than the military because they're going to be controlled by the U.S. military. Well, who's going to be controlling Japan? Who immediately just sees the profit margin, the industry growth, which allows them to build their country up bigger. They may not care so much about the wishes of the U.S. military, if you know what I mean. So part of that, I think, will dictate how it's used. But a dude showed up on Computer Chronicles, like I said, somewhere between 83 and 85, and he showed you a fully textured, wasn't photoreal, but it was damn amazing flight simulator for the military. Well, that automatically showed you a massive delta between the implemented use of technology and the processor power that was being afforded the military. I was shocked it was even on TV back in those days, because it would be another, I think about 8 years before we ever saw anything like that. In fact, probably 95, probably another 10 years. Reason being is that Castle Wolfenstein by id, and Doom was faux 3D. Beautiful, amazing. But the stuff this dude showed us in whatever year that episode came out, just look up flight simulators in the early years of Computer Chronicles on YouTube. Quake was the very first 3D version, full-blown 3D id software engine by John Carmack, which is, quite frankly, one of the most brilliant guys. Now, technically, too, you have GT Interactive's purchase of the Unreal Engine, about 94, somewhere in there. And I know that because they brought it into EA in 93 and we screwed up the deal. Dum-da-dum-dum. So machine learning comes in, and you need a lot of power for machine learning. Machine learning is doing stuff today that is tantamount to technical magic. And if we're talking about mind control patterns, this is why I'm bringing this up. It starts analyzing all of the digital results, plus new experiments that could be created that are far more efficient, and it starts to create fuzzy logic between 2 points, and it can generate as many points in between, and through post-analysis, figure out whether or not it was accurate or not. So you might think of machine learning. I'll tell you a thing you can look up on YouTube that is just mind-blowing. I might put it on the suggested content on the website, deepthoughtsradio.com. They took a GTA, which is Grand Theft Auto animation of driving in LA, and they hooked it up to some machine learning computers that only had data from Germany, German cities, German everything. They drove all over Germany like Google Maps and taught it, this is street, this is shrubbery, this is tree, this is human, this is a Toyota, this is a Mazda, this is a Mercedes. Fed it just billions of stacks of information. So you have this low-res GTA video of a couple cars chasing each other through LA, which is sort of a caricature of LA. It's a little smaller, right? And they said, make this real. Not only does this damn video look like you just filming out your windshield when it's over, not only that, okay, which is mind-blowing. And one of the funny things was that Germany doesn't have a lot of at least where they got the data sets, it doesn't have a lot of Rocky Mountains. And so we have Rocky Mountains in LA, Malibu and a bunch of other places. So the only thing that happened that was inaccurate was that it would take the mountains and cover them with green as they were a little bit smaller. And as you got closer, it sort of figured it out. I was like, man, this isn't green, this is rock. And so it would find rock patterns and put them up there. So that's the only place your brain, if you pay attention, you can start to see there's a little fuzziness and it transforms from green to rocky. But this technology in 2021 is real time, baby. Real time with off-the-shelf components. Unbelievable brilliance. I want you to see that in your brain, because what they're trying to say now is you make movies today with two different groups of special effects people. My buddy Kyle is what is called a previs guy. He uses lower res models, although they're pretty photoreal nowadays, according to him. And he figures out where all the camera angles are. He is a director inside of the computer. And he'll, for a dogfight in Top Gun, he'll put 30 cameras all over the place, render them all, and the special effects supervisor, who's the kind of the uber director of the final results, who's working with the real director, can look at shots and go, yeah, that looks pretty good. That's pretty badass right there. You know, throw away 25 of the 30 cameras. We're going to use the 5. And they just click them and say, keep those. And we want to punch in a few different places, and they're done. Once they're finished, it gets up to the next group, which puts in the super photoreal models, and they re-render it, and you get the final version that goes in the movie. Okay. So see that graduation process. What they're trying to figure out is, can we make video games where artists aren't that good? They simply put the base model in there, and the computer knows. Imagine having a bunch of K cars, which are those really blocky cars that came out of the early 80s, right? Ugliest car on planet Earth. But you actually put a little tag in each one of them. You're a Bentley. You're a Mercedes. You're this, you're that, you're this. But you're driving around a bunch of blocky cars that you drew when you were 5 years old. But machine learning, live, turns them into all those cars that look sexy and shiny and dirty with dents and all kinds of stuff. This machine learning thing figured out the license plate numbers. I mean, it was just amazing. The lighting was raw and perfect, as opposed to hyper primary color palettes like super reds and super greens. This thing was figuring out people walking down the street, crappy grass textures were turning into beautiful photoreal grass. Take it back to mind control. Machine learning, especially hooked up to a quantum computer. Quantum computer. I haven't said it in a few episodes. Simon Parks would be so proud of me. That system thinks of everything at the exact same time. It doesn't solve a maze by trying a little and then going back like little robots do in those robot competitions. No, it solves the whole maze in 1 second because it tries every point in the maze at the exact same time. That's what a quantum computer does. You stabilize 100 qubits, you've accounted for a computer that can now think of every atom in the universe. You get 300 qubits, you can probably conceive of every ethereal particle in the universe. I mean, that's how amazing this stuff is. Attach that to machine learning as the engine, and then attach it to the objective of figuring out the human mind. Now, remember what I told you about digitizing the human mind and that being fairly impossible to do. Well, machine learning is able to figure out, as Douglas Adams would say, the entire brain through a slice of fairy cake, using kinetic information to say, if this electronic pattern is cascading around the outside of the brain, of which we can sense accurately without disturbing the brain, then machine learning can guess what's inside the brain. And through experimentation of positives and negatives, meaning it predicted wrong or predicted well, it can figure out what's inside more accurately. Test, 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 and eventually, eureka, you've got mind control. Now, there's a second tier to this whole thing. Again, we've had people defect out of the intelligence agencies and said that by 1996, mind control was utterly figured out. With the caveat, never, ever, ever watch TV. And I'll just remind you, televisions that strobe at 60 frames a second or more now, because TVs go up to 75 hertz, 144 hertz, or even more. It's way over the refresh rate that's necessary to perceive animation. How do we know that? Because movie theaters survived on 24 frames a second for nearly a century. So you only need 24 frames a second to make animation occur. Okay. So my co-host from MK Ultra Radio, when we used to have that show, he went and did a deep dive on the television and said that, he reported back to us that one of the papers that was written about 60 frames per second phosphorus Canon CRTs was that it was designed to put you in a suggestive state, or a state of suggestibility, to hypnotize you a little bit so that whatever was coming through that television, the Marshall McLuhan medium warning, right, was going to be perceived as truth. Then you just got to pollute the airwaves with propaganda, and boom, you got the whole population that watches TV totally sold on it. Why are hippies, who are, there's always a group of hippies and they don't necessarily look like them today, why are they so nature bound? Why are they out, doing, water surfing and climbing mountains and generally way happier than the rest of us? They're not watching a bunch of TV. That's why. They're not politically acidic to the rest of humanity. And look at all of our friends in the world. The more they ingest TV, the bad kind, which is almost all of it, the more they ingest social media, they are the most unhappy, violent, suicidal people on planet Earth. And there's even a bunch of conspiracy people that feel like they're killing it by getting into red pilling. But the problem is they still ingest too much from the wrong sources, and they get into all those arguments online, and they're the opposite polarity, the same polarity, with the opposite intent. Being angry about the truth that they believe is the truth. So they can get a good grade for their intent, but perhaps a bad grade for how they're handling it. So you got to police all this stuff in your brain, man. So mind control isn't just a beam coming from some satellite down to your cabin house out in the woods. It's just there, and it's there in all forms. So this brings me to the closing subject, which is once you figure out and master the state of the mind that creates a particular result that you want as a deep stater, okay, then you can embed it in any equipment that is possible. And you're not going to tell anybody, right? One of the funniest things I have to hear from people is that, well, that project was canceled. Okay. All right. That just means that they told you something that made you feel better and they moved it underground. It's absolutely the cliche playbook of any black op thing. You figure out a piece of technology, you get it funded by the people, you bring it straight up to the Senate. Hey, if they're willing to give you money for it, you might as well take it. But as soon as they say, oh, that's really bad, we shouldn't be doing that, they're all looking at each other. They're not stupid. They're basically just telling the group that's bringing in the results, well, you're going to have to find a different way to fund this thing. And there's no problem with funding this stuff. And some of the research suggested that somebody, once Montauk was canceled, that someone brought in $10 billion in gold. I mean, why even go there? Just, we all know things get funded. We don't need any specifics. We really don't, because that just muddies the waters of what might have really occurred. But now we have this transformation from normal light bulbs that have a filament inside that stays hot the entire time, even though it's running off AC current. Okay. The filament inside, which I don't think there's a rectifier in there to make it DC, but it's just heating at a pace that it stays solid, and your brain is just nicely satiated by light in the room. Then they came out with these super toxic bulbs, right? Because they wanted to bust this public domain technology into a patented technology and then get it legislated that you have to use these things, which if you break them, they got mercury in them and all this other kind of stuff. But those disappeared, didn't they? Where did it go? It went to LED technology. LEDs are amazing. They barely use any energy. They're very bright. They have huge lifespans. I mean, if you buy an LED bulb that lasts any less than 15 years, then it's been designed to have obsolescence to bake out in less than 15 years. Because if you bought an LED screen, it's going to last 15 years. And that's just where it starts losing its nits or lumens. And it can last even longer than that, as long as it doesn't get damaged, right? So that's how amazing those are. But what's making an LED light possible? It's called PWM, pulse width modulation. It is being stimulated at the frequency of electricity that's being pumped through it. It has a hertz rating, basically, just like your TV. Your TV's now LED, right? Whether it be organic or not, it doesn't matter. It is pulsing an image to your brain at the same level of a suggestibility of all this other technology we've had through different technologies. It's simply been more advanced. So same game, but boy, is it accurate. But now imagine every light in your house is doing the same exact thing. And what if, hey, this is not a big stretch. As we talk about this whole thing being a platform, right? It's a platform of technology to get you to respond in a way they want you to respond. Well, what if one of the platform qualifications to make it easier to use this upper construct technology is to get you into a state of suggestibility, which then helps you fall for whatever they put on you. Without that suggestibility, they have to hit you harder and more amazing and maybe even cause more trauma and damage to you. One of the things that they talked about was that because pain is something you only sense in your brain, and if any of you have studied TMS, which is back pain associated with stress, you don't have anything wrong with your back. Your brain has trauma in it that's been lost. It's a PTSD moment in your brain. But for some reason, you haven't dealt with it. You haven't figured out what it is. It's not your fault, okay? What your brain does is that as this subconscious thought is coming toward your consciousness, this is what we think occurs because TMS is very, very real. Your brain will, where it can do it the best, which your lower back has a very thin tissue, right? You know, you touch your back and it's your bones right away, right? It starves oxygen from your muscle mass, causing pain. People go and get exploratory back surgery, then they create real damage to their back in the form of scar tissue, and they've screwed themselves up. This is why TMS clinics started up in the 90s, and they were having psychotherapy with people who were coming in with back pain, and they were having over, I think it was like an 83% cure rate without any back surgery of any kind. But that's why they came into the clinic. And again, there's a MASH episode where Hawkeye gets super duper stressed, and they portray this without using the TMS acronym because it wasn't invented. That acronym's huge. The real words are massive. I accidentally bought a book on TMS, and I read it, and I was like so fascinated by this thing. But they portrayed it in a fictional show called MASH. As soon as his issue was resolved, because he couldn't do surgery very well because he was standing up all the time and his back was killing him, as soon as the stressful moment came off, his back ache went away, and he was fine. Oh, wow. Isn't that amazing? This is why it's so good to have a good memory. If you don't see all these pieces like photographically and you can bring them together, then all the evidence is right in front of your face, but you don't make the connection. So what else could be involved with mind control as it relates to the platform? Well, if your whole house is buzzing, it's vibrating, right? I specifically go out of my way to buy old incandescent light bulbs. Yes, I got LED everywhere, of course, but I'm being lit right now by normal light bulbs. Inside my house, there's only 3 light bulbs that light my front room, 1 in the hallway, 1 inside the lamp in my bedroom. There's 1 in my bathroom, I think is an LED one, but that goes on, take my shower, get out, you know. Don't leave the fan on. The fan is a white noise draining of your brain. As you're listening to the white noise of the fan in your bathroom, it will be difficult to have a coherent thought. Turn the fan off and just listen to your brain. Anytime the power goes out in your neighborhood and you're like, oh gosh, the power went out. Well, just for 1 second, study how your brain just has this amazing lift of stress because all the Wi-Fi died, all the fluorescent lights died, all the LED lights died, all the computer monitors died. All things died. And you get this sense of reality back. But now let's talk about the atmosphere for 1 second, because we're going to tie this whole thing up and put a bow on it. We're talking about transmitting, potentially, through cell phone towers, satellites, planes that can do this, right? Jets. Electromagnetic waves down on human beings. Okay. So let's see. If the atmosphere isn't naturally conductive, then you're going to have to use more energy. You can still do it. Trust me. And if anything's close enough to the Van Allen belts, they got infinite energy, okay? And again, we have to assume they've got other energy sources that work. But there's something called geoengineering, and they spray things into the atmosphere. It has been admitted so many times around the globe. It's been admitted in the United States, but they just don't call it what we're calling it. But the Germans have come out and said by name and said it was a weapon it's a counter weapon to enemy radar and enemy imaging systems. It creates storms and erases storms, technology we've had since the 40s, man. Or these seed clouds. You can, again, if you have a wedding going on, you want to make sure the reception has no weather, you can pay $100,000 and people will spray over your area and erase a storm. You can buy that service, okay? $100,000. You're doing well in life, let me tell you. Okay. They spray aluminum oxide and they spray barium oxide into the sky. Now, there's reports of other things, and I'm totally on board with those other things, including some pretty scary nanosystems that can get into your system. But this aluminum and barium has been pulverized down to a nano level. Nano level things don't occur in nature very often. Definitely not in bulk, and definitely not coming out of any plane that's supposed to be in the sky. Okay, it's supposed to be contrails. It's supposed to be water vapor that is freezing, and then it melts off as the plane flies by. Again, it's only supposed to last up to about 15 seconds on a super cold day up in the sky. They get the longest one before modern chemtrail viewing, which is what we call these, is about a minute and a half in the South Pole. Okay, but these things now come out of planes that don't have any tail tags on them that match any known airlines, but they will buy airlines like Southwest plane. But if you look at it, it's got the Southwest paint job, but if you look at the back fin where it should say the logo, it's been painted out just like a taxi cab, just like the cop car in Blues Brothers. So imagine you go to a CEO of a major airlines and you say, look, I got $1 billion to offer you for all your old planes. You want brand new planes on your fleet? Who's going to turn that down? Let me just buy all your old ones up. Okay. Well, they're going to be used for various experiments and things by the government. Don't worry about it. Oh, hey, I don't even care. I won't. This conversation never even happened. But I'm going to have the most modern fleet against my competition, and I'm trying to expand anyway. Sure. Ping, 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 ching, 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 right? It's all done. Okay. So people are trying to wonder why these two chemicals are up in the sky. Dr. Russell Blaylock, this amazing neurologist, was given the chemicals that were pulled out of the sky, and he analyzed them, and he did his research on them. And he's a brainiac anyway. He said, look, this aluminum has been manufactured. So whoever is dropping this out of the sky is manufacturing this stuff and dropping it out of the sky. He said this stuff is so tiny that if you were to breathe it up your nose, those two little ducts where they put the little test up there to see if you got the little thingy where they're putting maybe stuff into your brain. Maybe, just saying. You should research that. The stuff will go up there, and it's so tiny that it physically can get through the blood-brain barrier that's supposed to protect your brain from toxins. Well, now you got aluminum in your head. Go study amyloid plaque clusters from Alzheimer's. When they do biopsies on the brains, those amyloid plaque clusters, say that 10 times fast, have aluminum concentrates in them. Now, it could be coming off aluminum cans, aluminum appliances. We did translate into aluminum big time in the 70s. And then they told people not to eat egg yolks, which supplies your gray matter with what it's made out of. And so you have neural tangling plus aluminum going up in the brain. It's just nonsense. It's bad for your brain. So I put a metal in your brain, which now I can hit you with the frequency to create what's called the piezo effect. I just keep hitting you with electromagnetism. And I got a little friend inside your brain that's going, I'm going to amplify this inside your brain. Ooh, easy, right? Why barium oxide? Well, it's a salt. That makes the atmosphere more electrical, meaning less energy can spread it way wider on a population. If you pay attention to chemtrails, what's really interesting about it, because naysayers, people who are basically too afraid to look up, and take photographs. They keep telling you it's contrails, but they don't happen all year round. But the weather conditions don't change. In Southern California, they built Disneyland 8 miles from my house because it has the best weather in all of Southern California. Not too hot, not too cold, and the rain is almost non-existent. Well, we'll go a month or two without them. But if it's 4th of July, when they know we're all outside picnicking and hanging out at the beach because everyone's got a day off, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Christmas, Easter, any day they think we're outside, my God, this place is gridded up like crazy. Funny correlation there for being a random thing. Talk to pilots. Go see my episodes on chemtrails. I won't repeat anything here, but I've talked to pilots, two commercial pilots. My buddy Kyle talked to 2 military pilots, and all of them were like, it ain't us, man. We don't talk about it. It's worse than UFO talk. So that could be part of the platform. Energize the atmosphere to make it easier to transmit. Put a metal in the brain, which augments anything that's in there. Then 5G comes around. It's every other house. And it's going to be up to 1 billion hertz. Just remember, your body is 5 to 9. And I mean not 5 to 9 billion hertz. I'm talking about under the base 10 number of 10. It fits on your 2-digit hands here, right? It can't exceed 9 of your digits. That's the average hertz of the human body. And they're hitting you with how much? I mean, it's gigantic, the percentage of electromagnetism that we're being exposed to that no preceding generation was ever exposed to once the radio was invented. And there is a lot of, I think, concrete knowledge that a lot of the illnesses that we have are these frequencies dismantling the fundamental components of the human cell, up to and including renegade configurations of nucleic acids, which we call viruses. So it could be that some of the illnesses that have occurred in history have occurred at the very precipice of an introduction of more frequency, more frequency, more frequency. There is a fundamental platform to discuss that and to consider it seriously. It's not conspiracy talk. It's a conspiracy, but it ain't fiction. So anyway, hopefully this was entertaining. Would love to hear any of your comments. There's a lot more details in those projects. I just have like an hour and a half here to talk to you, so I didn't want to go too far. But yeah, this psychotronic weapon system is very, very real. It's very logical. And at this point, it is, I would imagine, nearly kids' play for the scientists that are coming into it today. So if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. It's got everything up there, video, audio, social media, all new remastered season 1. I will be redoing at least one of the season 1 episodes for the final 10 episodes of this season. And we'll continue to reprise some of them into season 7. We have a store up there with a couple groovy shirts. We're going to be modifying some of the shirts that are up there. So if you get them now, you're going to have shirts that no one else has, basically. And we have the Patreons and the PayPal folks that donate on a monthly basis. So to you guys, thank you so much. Again, if you subscribe to Patreon for even $1, you get the episodes 12 hours to 3 days ahead of time. You get special episodes that are just between the two of us. I just did a color one, in case you're interested. But great people everywhere, so I appreciate all of you guys. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.